Hi everybody, it's great to be back here again. It's Friday, let's get down to Torah listen. This week's Torah portion, Bamidbar, we are actually beginning a new book of the Torah, of the 5 books of the Torah. The 5 books, again reminding us that we're approaching the holiday of celebrating the giving of the Torah to Israel, Shavuot, which is going to be a week away. And here, today, we're going to begin opening up with the first portion, Bamidbar. It's important for us to reflect what it was like to be in the desert. What was this desert experience all about? And this is a preparation, of course, for Matan Torah, for receiving Torah. So we'll try to combine it all together. Today I want to focus on a particular midrash that opens up with a very interesting question. If you look at the opening verse, in this week's portion, the Torah first describes the census that was taken when, on the desert of Sinai, on the second month, which is Iyar, on the Rosh Chodesh, the first day of the month, the second year of coming out of Egypt. And God tells Moshe to make a census of counting every male from 20 years and up. And it was done. But the word in Hebrew to take a census is used here, se'u. Se'u means to carry something, to uplift, to lift something. And the Midrash, brought down by a rabbi named Rabbi Pinchas ben Bar Idi, he says right away, why did the Torah choose the language of se'u, of to lift something up? It could have chosen, if it meant to say, make someone great, it could use the word in Hebrew, ligadel, means to make someone great, or liromeim, to glorify. So if it only meant to glorify Israel, it could have used another terminology. Why did it use the term se'u, to lift off, or to lift up? And he explains, in reality, to show 2 different possibilities here. And he says it could mean 2 things. And if we look in Joseph, don't forget, going back in Genesis, we'll get to that eventually again too. And Joseph, we know, was asked to interpret the dream of the cupbearer, and he translates in a positive light. And what does he say? He's going to be restored to his position, to the king Paro, and the Torah used the word, again, the same exact word usage. Word usage, se'u, is used in that verse regarding Joseph. Same exact verb, which means that Paro will lift up Joseph and restore him to his position. Same exact term that's used here in the opening of the book of Numbers. On the other hand, when the chief baker, hears that the cupbearer got this wonderful interpretation from Joseph, he wants also a proper interpretation. He wants a good interpretation. So he goes to Joseph for the interpretation. And what does Joseph say to him? Give out. It's not good news. Your head's going to be lifted off, and your body will be impaled on a tree, which means he's going to be hung and the head taken off, which means he's going to be put to death. So the other interpretation that Joseph gave for the baker was the same exact word, to uplift. But here it's going to lift his head so much, it's going to lift it off his head, off his shoulders. So it's uplifting him in a different way, right? To lift off his head. Sounds crazy. It sounds like Isis. Let's not talk this way. Anyway, but, we can have a little humor here, but let's not think about those things. It's a little frightening. But anyway, in reality, there are 2 ways of translating this particular verb, se'u, to lift up, right? It could be negative, or, as we see from Joseph, both sides are brought down in regards to Joseph's interpretations. So this is what Rabbi Pinchas says right away. He says, when you're looking at the opening verse in Numbers, I want you to think about that you have a dual understanding. You could either understand it positive or negative. The question is why? But in reality, why? We have a lot of things that we can explain in 2 ways. Which means we could look at the generation of the desert in a good way, or we can look at them in a bad way. We can criticize them. And that's really seems to be the introduction to the whole book of Numbers, is to sort of present that criticism and that praise in the beginning. But this is not foreign to us, because if we look in the story of Noah in Genesis, we know that it says Noah was a righteous man in his generation. And the Talmud in Sanhedrin 108a right away gives 2 options. It brings down 2 rabbis, one Rabbi Yochanan, one Reish Lakish. Rabbi Yochanan says, why does it say the word in his generation he was righteous? Because if he was in another generation, he wouldn't have been righteous. So that he said it in a bad light. He was criticizing it. And he gives an example. It's like a barrel of wine amongst vinegar. So the barrel of wine is going to smell good because it's surrounded by rotten barrels. But If he was, again, it was amongst other barrels, it wouldn't stand out. It could have been better tasting wine, better smelling wine. In other words, if Noah was living in the times of Abraham or other great giants, he wouldn't have stood out according to Rabbi Yochanan. But Reish Lakish says right away something different. He says, you know something? In his generation comes to stress the fact that although he lived in such a generation of surrounded by evil, he maintained his righteousness. And if he was in a generation of Abraham or someone greater like that, great like Abraham, he would have been even a greater righteous person. Surely he would have been righteous. And that's likened to a bottle of perfume. If you put it amongst a garbage dump, it's not going to smell as nice as it's going to be amongst spices. It's going to even smell greater. So here we see right away two approaches of looking at Noah. So it's not foreign to us. This is the way the Midrash wants to present ideas and showing two sides to everything in order for us to get the whole picture and understanding the whole picture. And here, what is the picture that they want to present to us in the opening of the book of Bamidbar? And in reality, we could look at the generation of the wilderness, and it's very easy to find them in a good light. And let's give a few examples. If there's another beautiful midrash brought down, referring to a verse in Chronicles. And we know the book of Chronicles is very unusual in that it had just lists names, it's sort of very repetitive, of listing names that were already mentioned in previous prophets and books of the Torah. And our rabbis teach us that in reality, the book of Chronicles is meant to be lidrosh, is meant to really to use the midrashic ways of understanding, because it's very secretive. There are many things hidden behind these words that seem to be superfluous, and therefore we have to always use the midrash. And there's a verse. I want to bring down the verse. If you look in Chronicles, number 1, we look at chapter 2, 6, and 7. It says like this. It says the sons of Zerach were Zimri, Eitan, Heman, Chalkol, and Darda, 5 in all. So it's giving the sons of Zerach. We know Zerach was from the tribe of Judah. And it's giving 5 different names over here. So who are these different names? If we quickly go through them, I'll skip over Zimri because I'm going to get back to it in a moment. Eitan refers to Abraham, the word in Hebrew, Eitan, means strong, steady. He was the pillar. Heman refers to Moshe Rabbeinu. Heman comes to the word in Hebrew, referring to someone who was loyal. There was no one more loyal than Moshe in the house of God. Kalkol refers to Joseph. It comes from the Hebrew word meaning to nourish, to provide for, provide sustenance. And that's, of course, Joseph, who was the provider. Darda comes from a double name. In Hebrew, Dor De'ah, the generation of knowledge, which refers to the generation here on this, what we're talking about this week's portion. In Numbers, the generation of the wilderness. So here we see there are 4 names that are referring to righteous individuals. Moshe, Rabbeinu, Moses, Abraham, Joseph, and the whole generation of receiving Torah in the wilderness, the generation in the book of Bamidbar. So who is the first name? Zimri. So our rabbis teach us that Zimri refers to a difficult name, Achan. Who is Achan? Right, the next verse here in Chronicles, and if we look again at Chronicles 1, 2, 6 to 7, we look at this. The next verse, it says, Achal, which is Achan, who brought trouble on Israel by violating the ban on taking devoted things. So we look in the book of Joshua. We all know the story where in Joshua, again, 9, we look at the story of Joshua. Joshua says, before they capture the city of Jericho, what does he say? You shall not take of the spoils of Jericho. All the spoils will be dedicated to God. And this again, I mentioned again in Joshua 9, it's Joshua 7 I see. So he says, you shall not again partake of the spoils of war, but they should be dedicated to God. And what happens? Achan, the opening verse, talks about Achan acted unfaithfully by taking of these spoils. And therefore, he was punished. But what's special about Achan is that he repented, that he actually came out and he told Joshua what he did. Right? He was asked to do the vidui, we say, confess. And very interestingly, the Torah is saying that Zimri, the first name mentioned here, the Midrash is teaching us, refers to Achan, which is brought in the next verse. So here, the word Zimri, why is it referred to Achan? Because Zimri in Hebrew means to cut. Because of his sin, he caused the fact that the 36 soldiers of Israel that went to battle against a place called Ai, if we recall. They were killed in battle, 36 soldiers. And that was a result of his sin. And therefore he's called here in the verse 7, Achal, which means in Hebrew, to blacken. He caused Israel's eyes to be blackened because of his actions. But in reality, if this is the case, he did a terrible, terrible sin. Why was he praised by being mentioned together with the other names here? And not only that, the verse in Chronicles ends by saying 5 in all. Why do we can count it ourselves? Why does it have to say 5 in all? So the Midrash teaches us that in reality, just like Moses and Abraham and Joseph and the generation of the wilderness, they all have a share to the world to come. So the same way, Achan has a share to the world to come. Now, not only has a share, but he's going to be with them. My question is, why did such terrible sin? And the answer, they proved in the verse, Joshua says in Joshua 7:25, why have you brought this trouble on us? And he caused what happened, terrible tragedy. And he says, the Lord will bring trouble on you today. Which means God will bring trouble today. Today you'll be in trouble, but in the future you will not be in trouble. In other words, he's hinting to the fact that he has a future. Now why? Because Achan, he truly regretted what he did. He truly confessed. And he repented. And according to the Torah, a person who repents is completely, God forgives his terrible sins. God forgives him. So what do we see from all this? We see that on one hand, the generation of the wilderness is we just put them up, focusing on Achan here, but we have to realize here the Midrash is teaching us that the generation of the wilderness were righteous, that they have the world to come. They're standing together with Moses and Joseph and Abraham and Achan. So how could we open up with a derogatory explanation by Rai Pinchas saying they deserving of having their heads lifted like Joseph did to the, Joseph said it's going to happen to the baker. Look over here, how righteous they are. So that's the other side. I was mentioning there are two ways of looking at it. So here we can look at the positive light, like Joseph's interpretation to the cupbearer. But anyway, so here we see one perfect example. To go on, what does it mean? What does the Midrash call, what is Dalda in Chronicles, and the Midrash saying it means generation of knowledge. And the Zohar Kadosh, or B'Shimon Bar Yochai, we just celebrated Lag BaOmer recently. The same thing, he explains, Dalda, he brings that expression, they were a generation of knowledge. Now why? It was like in the desert, God set up a perfect school for the elite groups of students. And they were given man came down from the heavens. And their shoes didn't wither away, and the clothes didn't get, whatever, damaged. They were able to sit and study Torah without any interference at all. This was like the wow, what a beautiful school. There's nothing greater than that. Everything was provided for them. That's why the Torah was given to that generation. Not only that, the Midrash says God waited many generations to special souls came down for the generation of giving Torah to the generation of the wilderness. So from these other sources we see, wow, they were very special individuals, and that God wanted to give them the Torah, and they should pass it on. So what happened? Where is the cutting their heads off? Come on, a difficult explanation. So if we see something interesting, the Gemara brings down another two-sided thing. In Sanhedrin, there's an interesting discourse between two rabbis. Rabbi Akiva, the famous Rabbi Akiva, and the other rabbi, Rabbi Eliezer. And what do they say? They argue whether the generation of the wilderness has a share in the world to come. Rabbi Akiva says, he brings down a verse, I'm not going to go down to, we don't have time to go through all the discourse and the Talmudic way of explaining. But Rabbi Akiva says they don't have a share in the world to come. And he tries to prove it from a verse. And Rabbi Eliezer says they do have a share in the world to come. And they're righteous, they will have a share in the world to come, whatever it is. So the question is, God accepted their repentance, just like very similar to, which is amazing, very similar to Achan who repented. The same way Rabbi Eliezer says that the generation of the wilderness repented and they will have a share in the world to come, because it says in the Psalms, Arba'im Shana Kut Bedo, and God swears, 40 years in the desert, and God swears, Shenishbati Bapi, God sweared in his anger, Imi Vona Menuchati, that they will come to his resting place, which means if they can enter the world to come. So God seems to be saying they're not going to enter. So the answer is, Rabbi Eliezer says, at that moment, but God changed his mind because they repented. And that's an interesting lesson in itself. But anyway, nevertheless, according to Rabbi Eliezer, they have a share in the world to come. But according to Rabbi Akiva, they don't have a share in the world to come. Why? What's going on over here? How is that possible? We just saw a generation of knowledge and how the praises they got, everything was done for them. They studied Torah all day long. They're angels studying Torah all day long. How could they not have a share in the world to come? That sounds crazy. But in reality, I think, and this is in my humble opinion, there's no way that Rabbi Akiva really felt they didn't have a share in the world to come. That's out of the ballpark. I can't believe that Rabbi Akiva would say about the generation of the world that didn't have a share in the world to come. No. We can't put them in the same category of those who don't have a share in the world to come. There are those exceptions to the rule. It says everyone has a share, except for certain individuals. Doesn't make sense that they wouldn't have a share. But Rabbi Akiva, in my opinion, was trying to make a very strong demonstration. He wanted to do that. He wanted to go demonstrate. And why? If we look in Kings again, the laws in the Rambam, law of kings, which kings I can talk about. The Rambam, when he talks about the law of kings, he brings down a very, very important historical fact. And when he talks about Messiah. I would like to actually quote it, because it's a very important quote. Let me try to get that. I have it in front of me over here. He says like this. Okay, where is it? I thought I had it here. A second, I'm going to take about your precious time here waiting for me to put all my papers. But there's an important quote which I'd like to bring down. Okay. Here we go. This is brought down again in the Rambam, in the Laws of Kings. And he says like this. It's brought down to 11, law number 3. And I suggest you'll look into that law. And he says like this. One should not presume that the Messianic king must work miracles and wonders. Rambam says, no, don't think the Mashiach is going to do all kinds of wonders. Bring about new phenomena in the world. Resurrect the dead. Or perform other similar deeds. No, we're not looking for a Messiah to do all those things. This is definitely not true, the Rambam says. Proof can be brought, he says, from the fact that Rabbi Akiva, one of the greater sages of the Mishnah, was the weapon carrier of King Bar Kokhba, which means he's saying something very interesting. That Rabbi Akiva, I'm going to bring a proof from him. He was the weapon carrier of Bar Kokhba. Bar Kokhba, he says Bar Koziva. It's the same name. Now, who is Bar Kokhba? We know that when the Romans rebelled, when the Jewish people rebelled against the Romans, they wanted to restore the third temple. And he goes on to say, and thought him to be the Messianic king. Rabbi Akiva thought he was the king. Now, what if he thought he was the king? How could he be Messiah? Why not? If he's going to go ahead and fight the battles against the Romans and rebuild the temple, then he could be, theoretically, he could be Messiah. And he and all the sages of his generation considered him to be the Messiah. So he says that him and the entire generation, they all considered him to be Messiah. But until he was killed in his sins, which means until Bar Kokhba died in battle because of his sins, there was a potential that he could have been Messiah. And here we see that Rabbi Akiva was the weapon bearer. Now, it's very important to look at the proper Hebrew translation, because other translations I saw in English, they don't stress the word weapon bearer. They use some other word that he was like, they supported him. It was much more than supporting him. He was, in Hebrew it's called nosei kilav, the weapon bearer. So if you look in the original Hebrew I'm translating this from, and don't make a mistake and look in English translations, that will not do justice. Now, what does it mean he was the weapon bearer of Bar Kokhba? Rabbi Akiva was a fighter. He wasn't only a person, he was one of the greatest Torah scholars who ever lived. In the revealed aspects of Torah and the deep aspects of Torah, there was no one greater than Rabbi Akiva. And he began, of course, his life at the age of 40 studying Torah. He started late in life, but he became such a great master of Torah. But he did not give up the first 40 years of his life that he was involved as a worker in working and understanding what work was all about. And Rabbi Akiva was a practical person, and in order to bring about Messiah, you have to fight for it and do it. It's not just waiting around for it to happen by itself. And therefore he combines these both beautiful words. And I think we take this message of Rabbi Akiva to why he said the generation of the wilderness does not have a share in the world to come, is because the wilderness generation wanted to remain in the desert. They wanted to stop at Mount Sinai and not go on to the next stage. What is the next stage? That is Shekhinah, divine presence resting in the land of Israel. There's another mountain, and this is what the Khatam Sofer brings down. It says in Psalms, Tzidkatcha ki harei el. God's righteousness is like two mighty mountains. What are the mighty mountains? One of them is Sinai, and the other one is Moriah, where the temple was built. In other words, Sinai, well, the Khatam Sofer explains it, I'm explaining it a different way than he does. He explains it that Sinai represents modesty. It was a small mountain amongst the larger mountains. And the Mount Moriah represents might, in that it's a high mountain, and the land representing the might of Israel. But I think we can explain in another light as well, that Sinai is the first stop. That represents the desert. That's the incubator of Torah. That's being the first stage. But the other stage is getting to Moriah. In order for us to reach Moriah, the Temple Mount, to build the third temple, we must come to the land of Israel, the land destined to fight against the battles of the nations, to build a homeland, to farm the land, and to bring our grains and our wonderful things we do on the holiday of Shavuot, when we bring the two breads to the temple, to show that this is the bread we bikurim, our first fruits of working the land. This is what Israel is all about, not to stop in the desert. We got to go on to the land of Israel. And that is why Rabbi Akiva said he wanted to protest. They don't have a share in the world to come. What is the world to come? The world to come is the land of Israel. That's the world to come. We know that's our future. In order to build the world to come, of course, there's a spiritual world to come. But we can't forget about the physical world to come here, building the land, which is the Garden of Eden in this world is Israel. And if you do not come to Israel, then you don't have a share in that. You've got to come to build the land and to develop the land of Israel. That's the beautiful message of why Rabbi Akiva is saying they don't have a share. Of course, they're praised, they're wonderful, great Torah scholars. But they sin with the spies, saying we prefer to remain, we don't want to deal with the giants. We don't want to deal with a land that eats up its inhabitants. We prefer to remain in the incubator, in our elite school where man comes down from the heavens and our clothes are perfectly fitted and our shoes don't fall apart. We don't want to have to make shoes and make clothes and work the land, because that requires another type. It also requires our connection to the land. That's what Shekhinah. The Khatam says something very beautiful. You take the Hebrew word Sinai and Moriah together, it spells the word Shekhinah, divine presence. In order for us to bring down divine presence, we have to have both mountains in the land of Israel. And that is the message of Rabbi Akiva. And that is why this week's portion opens up with two sides. We have to look at the good, the person must study, but he can't stop there. He has to go on to bring Torah down into practical use, and by building the land and coming to Israel, which is our goal. From here, the divine presence will shine. It will not in a situation where, again, people are sitting in the incubator and just stopping at that point. And that's why today, and there's so many Jews that have to move to Israel and come back to the land. And they choose to remain in exile, just like the desert and the wilderness. But God says, no, that's the sin of the spies. You've got to come back and build the kingdom of God in the land of Israel. Shabbat Shalom, B'Sarot Tovot, Yeshalot V'Nechamot.